Hi, I'm Tzvi Langermann, and I'm going to be talking to you about this very interesting codex, number 1649, in the collection of the University of Pennsylvania Library. I'm actually an historian of science, and perhaps the first question that you may ask is, why am I interested in manuscripts? Well, I am an historian of medieval science in Arabic and Hebrew, and most of our primary source material is still in manuscript. That is, these are the books that were copied by hand over generations and well before the invention of printing. And these are the books that contain the medical, astronomical, mathematical, philosophical knowledge of the time. But the thing is that even after these books are brought to press, we still have a fascination in manuscripts, sometimes because we don't trust the printed editions, because the people who printed them didn't do a thorough job in checking all the way the different ways the text was transmitted. But sometimes because even after you have a good printing, there are some interesting features in the manuscript that fill in a lot of detail about how these books were read and transmitted and moved from culture to culture and from group to group. And this codex is actually an extremely rich example of that. And these are some of the things that I'll be talking about. Now, the next question you may ask is, what is a codex? Codex is simply a bunch of different books that are sewn together in a single volume. Sometimes the books cohere together as a unit. They're all books on medicine or on philosophy, all by the same author. And sometimes they're not, because sometimes people would sew together various things from different sources simply because having them in one bound volume kept them from getting lost. The Codex 1649 actually has both. We have three medical texts, which I'll be talking about because history of medicine is my field, which cohere together, even though they were probably not copied by the same scribe, and a bunch of loose pages that have nothing at all to do with it, which I will not be talking about at all. So, what is in the text in this codex? We have three texts, all of them originally written in Arabic, though actually the authors were probably not native speakers of Arabic. The first author was an historian Christian who probably spoke Aramaic at home, and the other two were native speakers of Persian. But in the medieval period, the 10th, 11th, 12th century, Arabic had the status of English today. If you wanted to publish something and get it to reach the widest audience and the most important audience, you had to write in Arabic. Now, two of these texts are in Arabic, but written out in Hebrew letters, which is an easy thing to do, actually, because the Semitic languages are very closely related and they move seamlessly from one to the other. The middle text, the text by Avicenna, is a translation not from the Arabic, but actually a Hebrew translation made from the Latin, and the Latin was made from the Arabic. So I'll be talking about each of them, trying to, at the same time, give you a feel for what these texts contain and what was the medieval medical theory behind them, and as time allows, pointing out a few distinct or interesting features of the Codex. And then at the very end, I will have a few things to say about the Codex itself, the way it was put together, and how some of the blank pages were used. Now, the first text is the least well-known. It's a text by the name of Al-Morni fi Tadbir al-Murad, the book that is sufficient, all that you need to manage diseases. And in the next segment, I'll be saying more about the book and the author and how the book is structured. But I would like to begin at the end, because this text has a colophon. A colophon is a sort of note at the end of a copy of a book in a manuscript, in which the scribe, the copyist, tells us, if we're lucky, who he is and when he copied the book. And fortunately, the scribe for this book was very generous and tells us not only his name and his date and his place, but ends with a messianic prayer, which is very unusual and which helps put this copy in some wider historical context. The first thing, it is on your screen now, and the first thing And now this book was copied in, the information that he gives us is his name, which is David ben Shalom, his place, which is the city of Catania in Sicily, and the date, which I'll be talking about in a few minutes. Now, many of you, or some of you, should know that this hand is actually what we would call a Sephardi hand, a hand that is the way that the style of writing is the way Hebrew letters were written by Jews living in Spain and the Iberian Peninsula. It is not at all strange that this would be this hand used by someone working in Sicily, because at that time, Sicily was actually politically and culturally part of the Kingdom of Aragon, and also many Jews from Aragon and from the Iberian Peninsula moved there, some of them as refugees. Now the date is given as a chronogram. This is a new word that I just learned a week ago or so ago. What it means is this, that in Hebrew, as in Arabic and Greek and other languages, one can use the letters of the alphabet. Each letter of the alphabet has a numerical value. And if I want to indicate a certain sum, I can simply write out a word, and the reader will know to add up the sum of the letters and reach that sum. And if I'm fancy and learned, I can find perhaps a biblical verse that has those letters and use that to indicate the date. This is what the author of this book has done. But the chronograms can be tricky because it's so hard to find the words that will have the precise sum that add up to the year that one is looking for. He may not want to use all of the letters in those words to arrive at the sum of the date. It can be a bit tricky trying to get the numbers to add up correctly in connection with the letters that are marked in the chronogram. But the solution I've arrived at is that he's speaking of the 13th of Kislev, 5204 Anno Mundi, which yields actually Wednesday, the 15th of November, 1443. But if he had been copying this on Tuesday evening, he may well have thought that known that the Hebrew date had advanced to the 13th of Kislev, but forgotten that the Hebrew day of the week also advanced to Wednesday, just as many people will say that, say, Yom Kippur is on Tuesday evening, when in fact, when Yom Kippur is on Wednesday, then what's after sunset on Tuesday, it's also Wednesday. In any event, the hand can be, I think, is conclusively a Sephardi hand from the mid-15th century, so even if there's some inaccuracy in the way I've figured out the chronogram, I think it's pretty clear that this manuscript was copied in the middle or perhaps late 15th century. Now, he ends it with a fervent messianic prayer for redemption and for liberation from the nations, and for that God should take us to his holy homeland. And this actually fits the context well, because in 1391 there were very severe pogroms against the Jews in Spain, which led to many people to leave Spain and to think that the end is coming. And these sort of culminated in 1492 with the expulsion of Jews from Spain, from the entire peninsula. And this copy fits smack in the middle. So my surmise is that this scribe was someone who had left Spain in the early 15th century or the middle of the 15th century, but really didn't want to stay in Sicily and had some sort of feeling that this would not be his final stop, and was expressing this messianic prayer, which, as I said, fits into the context of Jewish history and Jewish messianic expectations very well. Now, the first of the three treatises is a treatise, as I mentioned, Al-Morni fi Tadbir al-Amrad, this book that is all you need to manage diseases, by a certain physician named Sa'id ibn Hibat Allah, who was, I think, worked in the 11th century and is the least well known, probably because his book was never translated into Arabic or Latin, into Hebrew or Latin, and never really came to the attention of scholars. But it's actually was widely used because it's an extremely handy book for the physician. It's arranged like most medical books of the time, covering the body from head to toe, beginning with the head and going down through the body to get to the feet, and giving for each disease just the name and a quick definition, a brief etiology. It's not very heavy on theory. Again, a quick list of symptoms, and then the meat of the book, which is the long list of possible treatments. So a doctor who was making a house call could hear right away what the patient's complaint was, thumb through to get to that part of the body, get a quick idea of what the medical theory behind this sort of ailment would be, and then get to what he really needs, which is the possible avenues of treatment. And you can see here in the images that these four items, these four that make up every entry, are marked by majuscule, by large, sort of what we would call bold, a larger font, and then in the smaller font you get the information. Now, this because this was a very handy book, it's the most heavily annotated part, because we can tell how books are used, or how intensively they're used, often by annotations. A medical doctor will often, in the margins of the book, add a potion or a treatment that he knows of that's not in the book because it's handy for him. Or he may make some other notes about the disease to fill in, the way we do. You write you annotate, mark up the margins of those things that are really handy and that you use day to day. And this book is heavily annotated, and it was probably I think used by practicing physicians over a long period of time, because some of the annotations are in very different handwritings. But there's one annotation which is really striking, because it's not in Hebrew letters. It's neither Arabic nor Hebrew, but it's written in Latin letters, and I have a blow-up here on your screen. It's next to the entry on pneumonia. Pneumonia in Arabic is called that aria, literally the thing of the lung, the thing that appertains to the lung. And in the margin, someone has written this odd word, ripolomonia, which is not in any dictionary. And we don't know where it could have come from, because there was no Latin translation of the book. When we get to the next treatise, we'll note that there was a Latin translation which the people who had the manuscript consulted. The best explanation, which was suggested to me by a colleague, is that this is simply an attempt to present a literal translation in the Arabic, in the Latin, of the Arabic term, race, translating that, and pelomonia being some sort of dialectical form of the word for lung. Don't forget that at this time, we don't have a developed Italian or Spanish or Portuguese. We have many different local variations, and these again are written up by people as they hear them. So this is one of these odd and unusual features that one can find only in a manuscript, which really add a dimension to how these books were read and studied. Here, as we see, someone who had the need to make up a Latin word or an Italian word for a book for the Latin, for the Arabic term for pneumonia. The second book is a book called Al-Adwiya al-Qalbiya, the drugs appertaining to the heart, written by probably the most famous physician and one of the most important thinkers of the medieval period, Abu Ali ibn Sina, better known as Avicenna. Now, this is a book, it means drugs that are used for treating the heart. And you may automatically think, oh, well, this is a book on cardiology, and I have a cardiologist, or I know a cardiologist. But it's not at all cardiology in the modern sense. In fact, there was really no medical specialization at the time, except for those specializing in eye medicine and ophthalmology. There were no cardiologists. However, this book deals with a different aspect of the heart as the locus, the thing that controls emotions, in the following way. In the Galenic system, the system developed by the Greek physician Galen, and which held sway throughout the medieval world in Europe and in the Islamic world, and even to this day, you can get Galenic treatment in India if you ask for Unani medicine, there are three parallel systems running in the body, one centered in the brain, one centered in the heart, one centered in the liver. Now, the system centered in the heart is responsible for spirit, vital spirit, which, to make a long story short, controls emotions. It's a material substance, so one shouldn't think spiritual meaning not having to do with the material world. It's a material substance. It's basically air that the body takes in and refines and making it a little more moist and a little warmer. And the basic theory was that our emotional state, particularly if we're happy or not, may be due to simply the material situation of the spirit. In other words, if the spirit is degraded because it's not being nourished, we're not taking in enough things that are nutritious for the spirit. The spirit needs nutrition, just like the body needs nutrition, then we will not be happy. But the things that will nourish the spirit are not always the same things. Of course, it would be different than the things that nourish the body. And this book basically is a handbook for treating the emotional problems by nourishing the spirit or rectifying whatever may be wrong with the material consistency of the spirit. And it's an extremely interesting book because it deals with this interface between, not really exactly mind and body, but more like the idea of emotions being a product not only of things that happen to us in the course of the day, but something physical within our physical constitution, which affects our emotion. And there's a lot of theory behind it, and Avicenna was a great philosopher, so it's an extremely interesting book. What I will be talking about in the next segment, though, is the interesting features of this manuscript in particular as to dealing with some of the substances that were used to improve our emotions by way of aromatics, the way of having some sort of odor that we inhale, and by the theory that Avicenna was putting forth, would improve our emotional health. Now, the thing that I'm focusing on here in this next piece of this talk is one correction in the manuscript and a few notes in the margin that have to do with some aromatic substances. These are, as I said, perfumes, which the person who is sad will inhale, and this will help make him happy again, or her happy again. So the first, he mentions two substances, but the one that I'm talking about here is called, it's ambergris. This is this thing that the whales spit out, and people gather on the beach, and it's used, I think, to this day in making perfumes. Very rare, a very expensive substance at that time, and something which was thought to have these sort of properties. And it's called in Arabic ambar, and the Hebrew word was simply taken over as inbar. But in the manuscript, as you can see here, which, as I said earlier, was translated from the Latin, not directly from the Arabic, the person has mixed up the order of letters. We all make these mistakes typing on a computer or whatever, and they do this copying manuscripts as well. But erasing and rewriting in manuscripts was not a very good option. And so what they would do, as you can see on the screen here, is simply to indicate the error by using dots. In other words, I would put 2 dots over the first letter and 1 dot over the second letter, indicating that the second letter should come first. So that's a way of telling the reader to switch the order of the letters in this manuscript. And this is a nice feature here. Another interesting thing to note, if you read Hebrew, that he's not saying inbar, he's saying imbar with a mem, with an M. And that is by the influence of the Latin translation. Because in Latin, the word is umbra with an M, then this man, I think, without thinking, simply made it ambar. And this is sort of thing that happens, I think, when you're moving from languages quickly, and these sort of slips come up. The second thing I want to point out in your next image is in a very interesting and odd and totally unique feature of this codex alone. The word for nourishing, as I said, these substances nourish the spirit in the way food nourishes the body. And in Arabic, he uses the word al-ghadhiya, which means to nourish, and it's a word that's used for food. The Hebrew translation also says hazana, from the Hebrew word hamazon, again meaning nourishing. But someone has written in the margins of the manuscript this Latin word reficolanti, which is actually the word that appears in the printed Latin version of this text. And reficolanti means to revive. So someone had caught their attention that the Hebrew word was not exactly the equivalent of the Latin from which it was made, if he knew it was translated from the Latin, or he somehow collated, compared the two versions, and noted that the Latin had a word that meant something different. But this word being somewhat odd, I think, and not known even to people who are students of Latin, led to someone else to write below the Latin note, as you can see here on your image, an explanation in Judeo-Arabic using 3 different words to tell us what this word refocolanti means. 3 different words, all of which have the same basic meaning of to reinvigorate. So we have here a very odd, circuitous route. The book was written in Arabic, translated into Latin. The Latin was translated into Hebrew. Someone had a problem with the Hebrew word and went back to the Latin version and wrote that word in the margin. And then someone else didn't understand what the Latin meant, so he wrote the meaning in Arabic. So we've gone from Arabic to Latin to Hebrew to Latin to Arabic. And someone will say, well, why didn't he just read the book in Arabic if that was the language that was most convenient for him? And the answer is, I think that the book was simply not available. It was not always easy to get copies of books at that time. And it's fairly common sometimes when you see someone copying or translating a manuscript to say, I was working with a bad copy and I couldn't find a better one, or else sometimes people would say, I made a great effort to get good copies, but sometimes you just couldn't get a hold of one. And I think this book was really, as I said, this book was much more popular in Hebrew and in Latin than it was in the original Arabic. And particularly in the 15th century, for whatever reason, there was a surge of interest in this book. And so the Latin reading public and the Hebrew reading public were studying it closely, and even Hebrew writers were writing commentaries on it. But when you wanted to sort of check something, if you wanted to check the original and you were capable of reading Arabic, you just couldn't get hold of a copy. As a matter of fact, up until recently, it was very hard to get a copy of the one printing of the book, which was printed in Istanbul in the 1930s. It's now been reprinted in a different edition. So this is a very unique feature of this manuscript that fits perfectly well into this context of Sicily, of Jewish scholars who are conversant in the languages and are making a very close study of the text. Okay, now the third and final treatise I'll be talking about is Al-Kamil fi Sana'at Tib, the complete book for the art of medicine, written by Al-Majusi. Majusi being a physician of Zoroastrian origin, a Persian, who worked at the Abbasid court in Baghdad, and wrote what was at the time considered to be the best, most comprehensive, well-organized handbook of medicine. Not handbook, but textbook, I should actually say, with a section in theory, a section in practice, well-organized sections on pathology, anatomy, and so on. Unfortunately for him, about 100 years later, 50 years later, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, the man I talked about in the previous segments, wrote his canon of medicine, which was the most important, which simply took over the medical instruction and medical practice from Spain and Italy to India, and reigned supreme for half a millennium. And so the book of Al-Majusi was, in a way, forgotten. Actually, it had a stronger presence in Latin culture, where he was known as Haile Abbas. That's how his name came out in Latin translations. And there, because of the work of Constantine, one of the translators, his book remained an important text. Actually, it was, strangely speaking, only one small portion of it was ever translated into Hebrew, though there are a number of copies. Of this is our codex is one of about a dozen copies that have parts of it in Arabic and Hebrew letters. And you can see from the still here, from the table of contents, again, get an impression of how well organized this book is. It is, I think, probably the least used of the three copies here. There are no marginalia indicating that someone who was treating a patient felt a need to jot on the margins something to add or correct or supplement what's in the book of Majusi. It was more of a book that you would read or learn in your medical education. But again, in this copy, we have at least one interesting feature, which is really unique and which adds an interesting dimension to how these books are translated and studied. There is a chapter in the book which is a sort of ethical will, as they call it, a recommendation to practicing physicians, in general, how to go about their work. And the first piece of advice comes from Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, who tells the physician to always choose the least invasive method, which is a principle of medieval medicine, the idea being that the body will heal itself. It may need some help from a physician, but if a physician tries to help too much by giving too powerful a drug or making too serious an intervention, it could do more harm than good. Now, this is the first piece of advice quoted by Al-Majusi, in which he brings the name of Hippocrates, but oddly enough, when writing out the name of Hippocrates in Arabic, he does not use the standard Arabic spelling. It wasn't the standard, but the most common, which would be Abu-Krat or Bukrat, something which actually sounds Arabic. But he writes it out in Hebrew letters as Hippocrates. So this man, who was fluent in Arabic, fluent enough to copy an Arabic text, still, when he came to a name, he said, "Well, I'm not going to copyright Abu-Krat. I know this man, this authority as Hippocrates," and he writes out Hippocrates. Now, I have a sense that the shin at the end could maybe betray some Portuguese origin for the person, and I will have something more to say about that in the final segment. So you see here, even this textbook, which is another copy of a book that really was not that widely used, certainly in this part of the world. There is these small features that let you know how the people copying it at a given time and place let their local conditions intrude and show up in the way names are spelled in conformance with the pronunciation that they knew. Now, in the final part of this talk, I would like to talk about two features of the codex as a whole. One has to do with the binding. As you can see in the images here of the cover, you can see writing along the sides. You see, and what happens is that to make a book cover, what we usually do, or at least in my generation, I may be out of date, would be to take some cardboard stiffeners, wrap some leather around it, and then put the book between them and sew it up. But at this time, in the 15th century, they didn't have cardboard stiffeners, so what they would do would be to take some pages, some loose pages lying around, perhaps from some other manuscript, glue them together, and use them as stiffeners. You can imagine that some important manuscript material could have been lost in this way, As a matter of fact, there are now people who are actively trying to recover these materials using modern technology and highly trained personnel. Now, if it so happens that whoever put together this codex seems to have used manuscript pages lying around from some other text, I have no idea what it is. As you can see here in the images, there are on the cover itself, and even in a piece of the pages that were used for stiffeners, writing. And this is something I just wanted to point out. I don't know, what to do about it now, but it's a feature of these codices which it should be brought to your attention. The second thing I want to talk about is how some of the blank pages were used. One of the things people would use right on these blank pages would be medical glossaries, because you understand that imagine a physician in Sicily, Spanish speaking, reading a book in Hebrew and learning about a remedy which requires some sort of herb or spice. But now he's got to go to the marketplace in Catania and buy this stuff to use on his patient. Well, what's he going to ask for? Obviously, the spice market or the herbal market in Catania, they don't know Hebrew or Arabic or anything like that. So what you need is a list of the names of these substances in the local dialect. And this is what is often done in medical manuscripts. Now, these lists are very valuable for linguists, and I am no linguist, because they will write out in Hebrew how this substance was pronounced in the local dialect. The names in this list are what we would call Romance, that is to say, languages that derive from Latin, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and more, but they're none of the above in terms of the modern standard versions. There's some local way that this thing was pronounced by a certain segment of the population living in Sicily in the 15th century. So here I've an image of one of these lists, and I've at least tried to figure out a few names. The first one is Darsini. You see the cinnamon, and the word sini means China, some sort of Chinese herb. And next to it he writes cinnamomo, meaning cinnamon, but cinnamomo with two M's, at least using modern dictionaries, suggests again Portuguese. So it's possible that some of the people who used this book were actually coming from Portugal. I'm leaving that open. And the second one is Darfilfili, pepper. These things require a lot of, first of all, they're much harder to read than the regular manuscripts, because they're scribbled, and the ink is not as sharp as one would like. And again, because you need to have training in Romance languages and how these words are pronounced, but they are a valuable resource and an interesting feature. And this codex here, again, has some interesting and wonderful material to supply to us. Okay, so these were a few things that I wanted to point out about this codex. As I said at the beginning, even though if printed books are available, historians of medieval science will always go to manuscripts because they're so fascinating, and each one has not only its own story to tell, but shines a sort of different light on the text and supplements our knowledge of how these texts were read and transmitted. Another thing is that one should always check one's work. I had to check the work of some previous catalogers who saw that there were some things to be added and corrected, and some people have made some important corrections on what I have done. And I think that this is, science grows and knowledge grows by exchanging, by people giving good critical feedback to what previous scholars have done. And it's a never-ending process of learning and researching and improving as best we can. So I'm sure there's much more to be learned from this codex, and I'm hoping at least to have time to study one of the treatises in much more detail.